Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. We're in the company, The World This Week in partnership with the Daily Beast. Aaron Zaleski is here. Welcome back. Welcome back as well to our Chief International Affairs Editor, Robert Parsons, Judah Grunstein of World Politics Review, and from Internet Without Borders, Julie Awono. We were taking a look now at the situation in Aleppo, where as the regime closes in on the most populated parts of East Aleppo, airstrikes resuming after a ceasefire that never really was. Moscow surprised many when it announced a pause in the assault late Thursday. The artillery shelling, though, never stopped, and the coalition continues to press its advantage against predominantly Syrian Sunni rebels of various stripes. Assad's claiming the victory as his own, but those fighting on his side are also Lebanese Hezbollah fighters, Iranians, and Shiite factions from Iraq, and even Pakistan and Afghanistan. Making the rounds over the internet is this video of a Russian military police unit deploying to Syria. It suggests, according to Le Monde's Moscow correspondent, that the Kremlin is preparing for the occupation of captured territories in Syria. Also, take a listen. It's not Russian they're speaking. They are speaking, Robert Parsons, in Chechen.
They are speaking Chechen. It's not a Russian military police unit at all. It's a Chechen military police unit, if it's a military police unit at all, belonging to the forces of Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya in the south of Russia.
So what does this mean? What is it?
Well, it's interesting the role that, I mean, it's a complicated question because it involves looking at what Chechnya's role is inside Russia. It's a Muslim autonomous republic in the south of Russia, in the northern Caucasus. According to Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, his elite units have been fighting inside Syria together with Russian special forces almost since the beginning of Russian involvement. And part of their policy has been to target Chechens fighting for the opposition in Syria to make sure that they don't go back to Russia. The concern being that they will, if they're successful in Syria, that they will attract others to come to Syria and after that go back to Russia and spread their views in the northern Caucasus.
Do you share the view of the Le Monde correspondent that this, could be a prelude for Russia actually taking an active part in policing Syria?
No, I don't think so. I think that's taking it far too far. We're talking about 100 people here. The active involvement on the ground of Russian forces is, for the moment at least, quite limited. The main contribution of the Russians to the Syrian government has been through air power, a very significant contribution, it has to be said. But on the ground, there's not, although there is a presence, there's not that big a presence at the moment. And it would have to be enormous to offset the influence of the Iranians or Hezbollah. I don't think it's going to happen.
I agree entirely. It would go against the entire logic of the Russian intervention, which I admit I was an early doubter in terms of how effective it would be because of some of the past history of Russian military hardware, especially its aircraft. It's been very effective in terms of air power. It's been very effective in terms of organizing the disparate elements on the ground, supporting the Syrian
Okay, so who owns the conflict then?
Well,
who owns this military victory that seems to be unfolding in Aleppo?
Here's the thing. The problem that Russia has had as sort of the orchestra, the conductor of this war, is that the Syrian army doesn't really exist anymore. As a real fighting force. There's a manpower shortage, there's discipline problems, there's training problems. So
basically, just look at the difficulties they're having near Palmyra with the Islamic State organization at the moment, being pushed back again.
Which means that the Iranians and Hezbollah have filled a big gap. But the problem for the regime is holding territory, because holding territory without bombing it into rubble. The Russians do not want any part of holding territory because, as we've seen over the last 15 years for the United States, for instance, in Afghanistan and Iraq, clearing territory from a low-level insurgency, an insurgency that has no air power, that has no real military organization outside of local pockets, is, as much as it can be destructive and brutal for the local population, is militarily the easy part for an armed forces of a state like Russia. The hard part is holding the territory afterwards. You become a sitting duck and a fixed target for the kinds of terrorist strikes that Russia wants to avoid at all costs. So I don't believe in any near-term future that there will be a large-scale Russian presence on the ground holding
won't be a
territory.
large-scale Russian presence, but with Assad's forces themselves on their own weak, then again, I ask the question to you, Aaron Zaleski, who owns this? Who's going to own it to make sure that they keep this territory? Is it the Iranians? Is it the Russians? Is it?
I think honestly, it remains to be seen right now. I think that we don't know. It's a cooperative of a bunch of different forces, and we don't. I think we'll know more in time. In the meantime, I think more focus should be put on the civilian population. The fact that Aleppo has been reduced to rubble, effective on the one hand, on the other, I feel like it could backfire.
Well, the UN Human Rights Commission this Friday pointing the finger at both sides, accusing the rebels in East Aleppo of holding civilians hostage.
Yes, but at the same time, the UN, what has the UN been able to do in the past 5 years to enhance the situation of civilians? It is true that the UN is also an hostage of its own policy, of its Security Council, composed of Russia, the United States, and the fifth nuclear powers of the world. So to me, Syria, unfortunately, and Aleppo is a symbol of that, is probably a failure also of international law, the ability of international law to regulate powers and avoid conflict as much as possible, and also probably not supporting popular revolts, because that's what Syria was about at the beginning. It's a bit saddening that it's being forgotten. It was a popular revolt against a power, a strong power, and now,
it's become a proxy war.
Yes, it's a disaster.
Yeah, we'll have to see how things play out Saturday when, again, John Kerry sits down with Sergei Lavrov in Geneva. Before the break, we promised you we'd do a democracy check on Europe. To do that, we now have to mention these days the R word, referendums. Calls for direct democracy led to the one that brought us Brexit, and more recently, last Sunday in Italy, that constitutional reform vote. In the case of Britain, it's turned into a battle between Downing Street and Westminster, with the Supreme Court hearing arguments over whether the mandate to execute the will of the people lies with Prime Minister Theresa May or with Parliament when it comes to the kind of Brexit that the UK negotiates starting in March with the EU. Over in Italy, the Prime Minister made it personal, putting his job on the line when he asked voters to approve changes to the country's institutions. He promptly got thumped for that, losing the referendum by a 60-40 margin. Even though Matteo Renzi tendered his resignation this Wednesday, he doesn't seem to be going away. He seems to still want to run the center-left Democratic Party and isn't afraid, he says, of snap elections to regain his legitimacy. This despite the rise in the polls of the populist five-star movement of satirist Beppe Grillo.
Noi non abbiamo paura di niente e di nessuno.
We're not afraid of anything or anyone.
Se le altre forze
So,
politiche vogliono andare
if other political forces want new elections right after the decision of the Constitutional Court, they should say so clearly.
perché qui
Because here, we all have to be responsible. The Democratic Party isn't afraid of democracy, and the Democratic Party isn't afraid of the vote.
Democratic Party isn't afraid of democracy. Matteo Renzi promised he wasn't a politician like the others. He's trying to hang on, it seems, though. Does that make him a politician just like the others?
Well, anytime as someone's a politician, they're a politician just like the others. I think there's a real distinction, obviously, to be made between referenda and elections, in both in the way in which they're covered in the press and the way in which people respond to them. Excuse me. In terms of the way people respond to them, when you're talking about an election between two parties and two candidates and two programs, you have people who might identify with one issue and less with another. But all in all, they're willing to make compromises on certain things in order to support a party. There are also political identities involved. Someone who might be a lifelong member of a certain party will be less likely to vote against that candidate. When you're talking about referenda, however, you're talking about one issue. It often gets boiled down to an up or down on the incumbent in power, who is usually unpopular in democracies. As we've seen across the board, usually elected officials, they start out with a high popularity rating, and it generally goes downhill from there. And it also becomes very difficult for the press to cover these sorts of things because it's no longer, there's no people, individuals to identify in terms of a horse race coverage. So you can't talk about who's ahead or what speech someone gave or what kind of rally someone gave. You're talking about oftentimes very technical and arcane stuff that people don't really have a great interest in or desire to follow, and they're just going to vote against the person in power. It doesn't always boil down to something quite that simple, and in Italy there were a lot of very local and particular aspects involved. But in general, to really pin any sort of important political stakes on a referenda, especially in the context of the past couple of years where there's a real anti-establishment sentiment that's very widespread, it seems like political suicide.
Right. I mean, I think it's over for Renzi. The no vote pretty much sealed the deal.
He won't be able to come back.
No, I don't think so. I think the one to watch now is Grillo, and it would be also interesting to see if in the months or years to come, Italy holds its own Italexit or Itexit vote, because his rhetoric is consistent with it's very anti-EU. He was one of the few political people to be pleased with Trump's victory. So we'll see.
By the way, did you catch the dinner conversation in Ottawa Thursday night? Q, the outgoing Vice President of the United States.
I've never seen Europe engage as much self-doubt as they are now. So the world's going to spend a lot of time looking to you, Mr. Prime Minister, as we see more and more challenges to the liberal international order than any time since the end of World War II. You and Angela Merkel. There's a lot of soul-searching going on in Europe, and you saw some of it in my country.
Robert Parsons, the fate of the world rests in the hands of Justin Trudeau of Canada and Angela Merkel of Germany.
Well, maybe putting it a little bit too far, I think, François. But yeah, I think there is a lot of soul-searching going on, particularly in Europe at the moment, but there will be in the United States, I imagine, over the months ahead as well, pretty quickly. In Europe, I think there are a lot of factors involved, and obviously the spread of populism at the moment throughout Europe is causing us to have a lot of anxiety about the way we're developing, not just in Eastern and Central Europe, but also here in France, to a degree in Germany. We've seen it in Britain over the Brexit vote, which brings us again to the spread of the use of referenda again, and raises the question, is it wise? I rather agree with Jude. I don't think it's wise to use them that often on specific issues. I think in the case of the recent Italian referendum, it was justified on the issue of Brexit, which is an enormously complicated issue. To try and reduce that to a vote on one sentence is, for me, insanity.
There's a fundamental problem in Europe for the past 5 or 6 years, which is essentially that voters have consistently expressed a desire for one thing, and they can't get it. Basically, national politicians are hamstrung by European Union policy, which is to impose austerity to come back from the debt crisis. And voters across the continent have been saying, we want some stimulus. And it's easier to do things like a constitutional reform to make it easier to pass labor reform, because that was the ultimate end goal here. When people are not tightening their belts in a brutal austerity program. And we see it, we saw it in... I think in Great Britain, it might be a little less pronounced because there's a little more fiscal discipline. But in France, I'm convinced that that's a huge element in the rise of the National Front here. In Greece, for instance, not only have the Greeks been suffering brutally, they voted on a referendum to reject the austerity program. and then had to basically accept one that was essentially tougher. There were creative ways that some sort of spending to spend Europe's way out of the recession and out of stagnation was possible. It was vetoed essentially by Angela Merkel, who is now the great hope of liberal internationalism, and who just recently herself, this past week, proposes a ban on full veils in Germany. That's the fundamental original sin of what's gone on in Europe over the last 5 or 6 years.
Right, the austerity question. By the way, turning our attention to what's happening south of the Canadian border, still no news on who the next U.S. Secretary of State will be. But if we're to sum up Donald Trump's picks so far, mostly millionaires and military brass. Lots of choices have the left up in arms in the U.S. An attorney general is perceived as curbing voting rights. A education secretary who would undermine equal treatment of public schools, a labor secretary who's against raising the minimum wage, and as the new head of the Environmental Protection Agency, a climate change skeptic who's the current attorney general from the oil-friendly state of Oklahoma, Aaron Zaleski.
So it's basically the appointees thus far are at odds with the agencies they're supposed to be running. So I don't know if that's not irony in the worst possible sense. I don't know what is.
And another issue that's popping up more and more, Donald Trump, still on the campaign trail, it seems, this Friday in Louisiana, part of his thank you tour, and who still is on Twitter. When the head of Indiana Steelworkers Union Local 199 contradicted the number of jobs the president-elect claims to be saving at the Carrier air conditioner plant, Trump fired these two tweets off. Chuck Jones, who's president of that union, has done a terrible job representing workers. No wonder companies flee the country. If United Steelworkers Local 199 was any good, they would have kept those jobs in Indiana. Spend more time working, less time talking, reduce dues, says the president-elect. It's quite a serious story, actually, Julia Wono, because the New York Times putting out a story saying that the president could be engaging in cyberbullying.
Absolutely.
This union boss, whose name is Chuck Jones, has been inundated with phone calls and insults ever since those two tweets came out.
Absolutely, because ironically, the Trump fan base, let's call it that way, is very disciplined. So whenever they've got an enemy to attack, we've seen that with Kellogg's this week. You know, Kellogg's is the new Breitbart, which being the alt-right website, being the target of their attack. So it was indeed cyberbullying, and it's dangerous because this man represents a counterpower. Is a president of a union. The president-elect has been attacking the free press. What kind of example the United States is giving as a democracy here? It's quite worrying, and it gives even more justification to other countries elsewhere in the world who have been practicing such attacks to counterpowers and such attacks to democracy. So.
All right, on this point, there's also another domain. We're wondering whether or not Donald Trump's going to continue to tweet when he becomes president. We're still wondering whether or not he's going to really unwind his business interests. It's our Media Watch segment. Yeah, we're talking about unwinding the business interests. Emma James is here with our Media Watch segment. This announcement that came out on Thursday that he's still tied to the television show Celebrity Apprentice?
Absolutely. He will retain his position as executive producer of the Celebrity Apprentice programme, which, of course, was part of his domain when he was social or television king, if you like. There was an exclusive report from Variety magazine that brought this to everyone's attention, which perhaps is where we're going to get all our important presidential updates from now on, who knows. What they point out is that they don't know how much he'll earn, but what people are concerned about isn't the amount, it's the possible conflict of interest. But Variety plays that down, saying that the critics should remember that other sitting presidents have written books. So they're basically asking people not to exaggerate because they earned royalties from writing books, so that's fine. It's all the same thing. There's been a lot of reaction online and a real range of reactions too, but a lot of disbelief to this one. Remember when people got mad that Obama went golfing? Those same people are justifying Trump's involvement with The Apprentice while he will be the president. Other people saying things like this, Trump to remain executive producer of The Celebrity Apprentice, ensuring he'll have something to do while Mike Pence is running the country. Others making slightly more serious points, though. Trump keeping his job in case his other show, America, has low ratings. And this one too. Trump's made it clear he doesn't have time for intelligence briefings, but has plenty of time to look at rough cuts for The Apprentice. Because as we understand it, he's only taking about one a week rather than the daily briefings that would be expected. And finally, the issue of conflict of interest is an interesting one. As this Twitter user points out, the emphasis on Trump's apprentice conflicts lets NBC off the hook. You can't be in business with a president that you're covering. This is nuts.
Judah Grunstein, you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. But at the same time, I think that the kind of tone that we're taking to discuss Trump is a major mistake. I think that we make light of him and we act like it's there's obviously humor involved. At the same time, he has a great appeal to a certain demographic. He manipulates them very expertly. And part of that appeal has to do with ridiculing global elites and elite establishment types like ourselves who comment on it from a very often condescending way, which is understandable. At the same time, it's a mistake because it's going to come back and bite us.
Okay, so attack this from a non-condescending way.
Well, there's obviously conflicts of interest, but at the same time, there have been conflicts of interest before Trump that were sort of basically overlooked or minimized. That's not to justify it, but it's to say a lot of the things that we're attacking him for will either seem not very understandable to some of his demographic and some of his constituency, or else hypocritical. And so in that sense, one example is the Taiwan phone call from last week. The one China policy is actually pretty hard to explain to someone who isn't paying really close attention to East Asia's strategic landscape. So it makes kind of sense. It makes sense to a lot of people when he says, wait, we're allowed to sell weapons to them, but I can't take a call from the president. That will make sense to his constituency. So if we condescend to that and say, oh, well, obviously he doesn't understand anything about East Asia, then we're condescending to millions of people who agree with him instead of trying to explain it in a way that doesn't alienate them. So again, this particular issue is much more clear-cut. There's a conflict of interest. You can almost imagine him hiring people from the show for government positions and turning it into almost like cabinet position interviews. It's almost how he's been conducting his cabinet interviews anyway. But at the same time, this is a more open and shut case. But I really think that the joke will be on the establishment and on pundits and on commentators if they don't address this in a different way.
No, but there are other issues that are being addressed with this president-elect. For instance, the issue of targeting specific populations of the United States. That's a very serious issue that has been taken seriously and that has been explained by the liberal or mainstream press, as called by the fan base, Trump fan base. So it's probably that this issue is probably a bit less serious than the Muslim registry, which has been dealt with quite seriousness, I think. And I don't think we should put more, reproaching even more things to the press, more than what the electoral base of Donald Trump has been doing in the past 12 months. So yeah.
Another person who's coming in for a lot of criticism with this is Donald Trump will not continue to host Celebrity Apprentice. It is going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, who is stepping into his shoes. Now, interestingly, he is also an executive producer, but it is worth remembering this headline, Trump just lost the Arnold Schwarzenegger vote, because the former Republican governor was very, very vocal before the election saying that he had always voted Republican, but he would not vote for Donald Trump. He issued this statement ending with the words, "It is not only acceptable to choose your country over your party, it is your duty." So it is an interesting one there, because people have been saying, well, maybe he didn't know, but if he's an executive producer, it's highly unlikely he didn't know that Donald Trump was going to be staying in the fold on this one. A Twitter user here pointing out that Americans should ask Schwarzenegger to remove himself from the Celebrity Apprentice gig. This is unethical and un-American, a real nod to the fact that he said it was the most American thing you can do not to vote for Donald Trump. Interestingly, though, Donald Trump has said, we chose Arnold. And this is a real win-win situation for Donald Trump, because as executive producer, if it goes brilliantly, he can take all the credit. And if it goes badly, he can sack Arnold Schwarzenegger and say, I was so much better at this.
All right. Many thanks for that, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. I want to thank Judah Grunstein, Aaron Zaleski, Robert Parsons, Julia Wonos. Stay with us. There's more news to come. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.